Hello, welcome back. Chapter 4, Managing Money. Let's close it off with understanding the federal budget. Have you ever wanted to know what those billions and trillions really mean? Let's get to it. So let's start with some federal budget basics. First of all, receipts or income represent money that has been collected. Outlays or expenses represent money that has been spent from the point of view of the federal government. Net income is receipts minus outlays. If the net income is positive, the budget has a surplus. If the net income is negative, the budget has a deficit. It makes sense, right? If we have money left over, cool. If we don't have money left over, that's a bummer. Okay, so let's look at a personal budget, and then we're going to try to expand it into a country size model. Suppose your gross income last year was $40,000, and you spent $20,000 for rent and food, $2,000 for interest on your credit cards and student loans, $6,000 for car expenses, car payment, oil changes, tires, gas, insurance, all that stuff. $9,000 for entertainment and miscellaneous expenses, and then you also paid $8,000 in taxes. So what's up with your money, right? Well, the $20,000 plus the $2,000, $6,000, $9,000, and $8,000 that we paid out tells us that we paid out, right? Total outlay was $45,000. Our receipts were $40,000. 40,000 is less than 45,000 by 5,000. So there was a deficit. We didn't have enough to cover that. A deficit represents money that is borrowed or taken away from savings during a single year. So it's always a deficit is a single year. The debt is the total amount of money owed to lenders, which may result from accumulating deficits over many years. Right? A deficit is a single year. Single paycheck is in my mind, right? On my scale, federal scale, from a single year. The national debt is adding up all the deficits, even when we have some surpluses. This is the rolling total that the government has or owes. So the federal debt at the end of 2020 was approximately $27 trillion. If this debt were divided evenly among the roughly 330 million citizens of the United States, how much would you owe? Remember, 27 trillion, that's 1,000, that's a million, 100,000 million, and billion, trillion. Nobody wants to do math with that many zeros. You have to remind yourself constantly how many zeros it is. So that's 3, 6, 9, 12, it's 13 if we use scientific notation. Same thing with the 330 million, right? That's 3, 6, 7, 8 places to move the decimal into scientific notation, so we don't have to deal with all those zeros. That's why we did chapter 2. So when we divide 2.7 by 3.3 and we handle our times 10 to this, we'll end up with 8.2 times 10 to the fourth per person. 8.2, we move the decimal 4 times, fill in zeros as needed, and we find that if Americans were just fed up, I want this federal debt over, in 2020 we would have all ponied up $82,000, been done. But I gotta tell you, 2020, my 15-year-old probably couldn't afford that. That's why we still have a federal debt. For 2020, the gross domestic product was $20.9 trillion, and the total deficit was $3.13 trillion. Find the deficit as a percentage of the gross domestic product, right? The gross amount that we made. How does this percentage compare to the historical average? All right, so the total deficit was 3.3 trillion. Out of the 20.9 trillion that we produced, All right, 3.3 divided by 20.9. They're both in trillions. Awesome. We'll multiply that by 100, put it into percentage. And so we're looking at 15%. Our debt, our total deficit was 15% of what we made, of our gross domestic product. Now, if you look in your book in figure 4F.3, we find the average deficit percentage by subtracting the average revenue percentage from the average spending percentage. And it's a 5-decade average. So we could do our calculations. 20.3% minus 17.4% is 2.9%. And so the deficit of 15% of the gross domestic product was way above a 2.29% average. We had some serious debt to deal with. And it was a 2.9% average over a 50-year period. In fact, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the deficit in 2020 was higher than at any time since World War II. All right, we got in some serious stuff there. Now, 2020, you might know that year for some reason. The world went crazy. All right, so yeah, a lot of money was spent on a lot of things, and there wasn't a lot of oversight at the time. And who's responsible for that? Who's responsible for this national debt? The national debt is every elected politician that has ever been in office is cumulatively responsible for it. We would love to be able to put our finger and say, this president, number that, his name, because we haven't had a female yet, but his name was this. No, it's all of them. It's an accumulation. You do the right thing by putting the right people in office to fix that. And if they don't do it, we vote in new people and give them a try. That's who's responsible for our federal debt, in my opinion. The publicly held debt, or net debt, represents the money the government must repay to individuals in an institution that bought treasury issues, right? We talked about bonds, investing in T-bonds in an earlier video. Whereas the gross debt includes both the publicly held debt and the money the government owes to its own trust funds, right? They borrow from Social Security. They borrow from this. They borrow from that. That's part of the national debt. Okay, so the unified budget represents all federal revenues and spending, right? The unified budget is all the money that the United States government brings in and sends out. Off budget is the portion of the unified budget that is involved in Social Security. Social Security is supposed to be there untouched. On budget is the rest of the unified budget, everything that's not involved in Social Security. Therefore, the following relationship holds. Unified net income, it'd be nice to have a space in there. Unified net income minus off-budget, should be a hyphen, not a subtraction, minus off-budget net income is equal to the on-budget net income. Personally, I would take off-budget net income plus the on-budget net income, and you'll get the unified net income, however you want to think about this formula. Let's talk about on and off budget. The federal government had a unified net income of a negative $587 billion, a deficit in 2016. However, the government also collected $34 billion more in Social Security revenue than it paid out in Social Security benefits. Right? What do we call this excess $34 billion of Social Security revenue, and what happened to it? What was the government's on-budget deficit for 2016? Let's discuss. The $34 billion excess Social Security revenue represents the off-budget net income, a surplus of off-budget for 2016, because it's counted separately from the rest of the budget. Social Security is separate. It's supposed to be there for us to have our retirement when we get to the appropriate age. By law, this $34 billion had to be added to the Social Security Trust Fund. It had to be added. Unfortunately, it had already been spent on programs other than Social Security, so the government instead added $34 million worth of IOUs to the trust fund. So not only did we not get that 34 billion into Social Security that we should have, that would then be earning interest, they said, we're going to use that for something else we owe you. But they have to pay that back, and that's what we need to make sure happens. Because the 34 million worth of IOUs will have to be paid eventually, it's included in the calculations of the on-budget deficit. Minus 1,587 billion, minus 34 billion. That's not true. Let's remove this one. If we think about the slide previously, let's go 2 earlier. Right, the negative 587, negative 587 billion, and the 34 billion that they borrowed from Social Security, we're now at a negative 621 billion. So even though we had 34 million surplus in Social Security, somehow we increased our unbudget deficit to 621 billion. We had extra, and the government found a way to make that work against us. We need new elected officials. What year is this? It doesn't matter. No matter what year I'm recording this, we probably need new elected officials. All right, let's look at tax increases. In 2019, individual income taxes made up about 50% of the total government receipts of $3.4 trillion. The people paid 50% of 50% of the total government receipts income was from income taxes. Suppose that the government needed to raise an additional $600 billion through individual income taxes. How much would taxes have to increase? Neglect any economic problems that the tax increase might cause. So we're not going down the line. We're just looking, if we need this money, how are we going to get it? Individual income taxes accounted for 50% of 3.4 trillion. 50% of 3.4 trillion is about 1.7 trillion in government revenue. If I want to raise an additional 600 billion, if we think about 600 billion, that's 0.6 trillion. That way our units match up. I would bring this total 1.7 trillion plus 0.6 trillion to 2.3 trillion dollars. All right, that's what we'll need. In percentage terms, this amount represents a tax increase of, the new value is 2.3 trillion minus the old value of 1.7 trillion, the amount, the 50% of which, that is the 50% of which the people paid, divided by the 1.7, that'd be a tax increase of 35%. On average, everyone's income taxes would have to increase by more than 35% in order to generate this additional revenue. The problem is we have 330 million people in this country, but not all 330 million people work. The working individuals, the people that have income and are getting taxed, it's not being spread out by the 330 million. It's being spread out only among the workers. And that 35% increase, that's why people freak out. Absolutely. I do too. All right. Thanks for watching. How the federal government ruins our lives daily. No, I'm just kidding. Politicians need oversight. We are the people that need to do better on oversight. So our politicians are working for us. So our money is getting used for what we need. This is nothing against any political party. I haven't mentioned the words of any political party because they're all responsible, in my opinion. So I'm not hating on anyone unless I'm hating on everyone. My apologies. Let me know if you have any questions.